Welcome to Capriza UX and UI training, covering the fundamentals of micro app design. In this three-part training, we will be covering user experience and user interface best practices as they apply to designing micro apps. There's a lot we're going to cover, so let's get started. This training is based around the layers of user experience framework created by Jesse James Garrett. We will move through the 5 layers from the abstract to the concrete, bottom to the top. Strategy, scope, structure, skeleton, and finally surface. Each layer is dependent on the one below it, and thus the choices available to micro app designers on one layer are constrained by decisions made in those below it. Layer 1, strategy. This first layer is critical to designing a successful micro app as it incorporates not only what your company wants to achieve, but what your users need as well. There are 3 important things to define for this layer. First and foremost, define the problem the micro app will solve. What is the ultimate goal of the micro app? Is it meant to enhance or replace a process? Second, define your audience. Who exactly is the user we are building this micro app for? What are their unique needs and pain points? Finally, keep business objectives in mind. How will this mobile workflow improve our business? How will success be measured? During this phase, micro app designers should always remember that the operative word in user experience is user. It is highly recommended that micro app designers talk with their end users as early in the design phase as possible to ensure their specific needs are met and constraints are accounted for. Background information such as job function, demographics, context, and tech savviness all can have major implications on the usability of the micro app. Always remember that you are not your user. Layer 2, scope. This second layer defines the way in which the various features and functions of the micro app fit together to enable the user to complete the task. There are 3 key things to keep in mind when defining the scope. First, narrow the scope to what we at Capriza call the coffee shop moment. In other words, ensure that the scope of your micro app enables the user to complete the transaction in the amount of time it takes to wait for a coffee order. Second, consider how you can take advantage of mobile functionality to further enhance the user experience. Mobile devices have many advantages over web applications, such as GPS location, camera uploads, navigation, tap to dial, etc., that can simplify transactions. Lastly, avoid featureitis. When defining the scope, ask yourself, what is the minimum number of features we can provide that will help the user accomplish their goals? There's often a tendency to want to add more and more features in the hopes of improving a micro app, but this more often leads to overcomplication rather than increased user satisfaction. Moving right along, the next 2 layers represent the bulk of this training. Here we arrive at layer 3, structure. Here we begin to make the transition from the abstract to the concrete. Before designing UI such as buttons, forms, and the like, micro app designers must first lay the groundwork. First, we'll consider the micro app information architecture. How will the pages and information be organized to make it understandable? Great care must be taken to arrange and group entities in ways that make sense to your users. Second, be purposeful with micro app navigation. What mental model do we want our users to rely on when navigating through the micro app? Is it a linear flow where the user progresses through a fixed number of steps, or are there branches? Finally, illustrate the user flow. How will the user interact with the micro app? When sketching out your outline, make sure to document each necessary action. To map out your micro app structure, we recommend the following steps. Audit each of the source application pages for content and function that must be included in the micro app. The easiest way to do this is to take screenshots of each source application screen in the workflow and place boxes around the controls required for the micro app. As we discussed in layer 2, make sure you are leaving out any unnecessary features. If you are not sure if you should include a data point or a button in the micro app, ask yourself, is this information or an action that is necessary for the user to complete the transaction? If it's not, leave it out. Next, make sure that the features and functionality you have mapped out also take into consideration potential errors and variations in the workflow due to user roles and permissions. There is a natural tendency only to think of the ideal errorless experience when designing your micro app, but failure to incorporate the unhappy path will lead to errors and ultimately poor user experience. Grab a pen and paper and start mapping out your microapp's flows and structure. Starting with low fidelity sketches makes iteration faster and easier. Identify the levels, groups, and relationships in the proposed microapp. Think about the different ways to structure the microapp, what the source app lends itself to, and what it will mean for development time. For example, is the microapp a single form where the user will proceed through steps 1 through 5, or are there potential branches the user may go down depending on his or her choices? When mapping out your microapp, make sure to identify the type of navigational structure that best fits your use case, as this will help determine additional design decisions. At the most basic level, there are 3 types of common navigational structures for microapps. Simple linear navigation is a simple step 1, step 2, step 3 process. There are several of these types of microapps included in our templates, such as the Submit a Multi-Step Request template. The second, tree navigation, is a more complex structure that is comprised of several branching flows that may be unrelated. The My Opportunities template is an excellent example of this, as various controls on the account details page lead to pages to view contacts, attachments, etc. that are otherwise unconnected. Finally, some microapps employ a combination of the two. For example, the Manage PTO template enables the user to travel down separate branches to view his or her PTO balance, edit an existing PTO request, or submit a new request. In the last branch, the success message follows a request submission that takes the user down one more level. The deeper you go down one of these structures, the easier it is for a user to get lost in information. Therefore, the best microapps keep levels to a minimum, keeping content as simple and focused for the mobile moment as possible. How do microapp designers simplify navigation? There are a couple strategies for limiting navigational levels that may be useful. First, separate tangential use cases into separate microapps. If branches and flows of your microapp are separate enough, perhaps they warrant their own. This results in 2 far better microapps in that they are targeted and discrete use cases. Second, take advantage of the first page of the microapp. It is always best to provide meaningful content to the user as soon as possible. If the first page of the microapp only has 2 or 3 buttons, like this first screenshot shows, it is a missed opportunity. Instead, prioritize one of these actions by automating to the destination and making the secondary actions available from the automated page. The secondary action will still be a single tap away. Finally, take great care in approaching tables and decide if drill pages are necessary. Drill pages show additional columns that cannot fit on the main table page. We'll talk about tables a little later, but it's important to remember that drill pages add complexity to microapp navigation. Once a basic user flow has been established, zoom out and look at the use case in its simplest form. Consider using a template. The Caprisa Designer has many different categories of templates built from the most common use cases we've seen. They are designed with the best UX practices in mind and may match to the microapp that you're building. Though these templates are pre-configured with default pages and components, they are flexible enough to be repurposed as needed. If there isn't a template that matches the use case, fear not. We will later discuss leveraging individual pages and components that can be imported into your microapp to enhance your unique use case. This concludes the first part of our training. Please continue to part 2 to learn about layer 4, skeleton.